Thank you very much, and welcome to all of those of you who've come to this session to talk about, I suppose, what is the preeminent story of our times, notwithstanding the death of the Queen, which I notice is being treated by the news organizations, the broadcast news organizations in the United States with the same sort of reverence as it's being treated in the UK. So thank them for that. But I still think that the Ukrainian story is, in the long term, of much deeper significance for the world. We have a stable monarchy in the UK. I think it will survive even the death of the Queen, esteemed as she has been. So to talk with me about the reporting of the Ukraine war and some of the issues that has thrown up and is throwing up, I have three very different and very, very distinguished women journalists. Firstly, I've got Sevgil Musaieva from the editor-in-chief of, you'll have to forgive my pronunciation.
Ukrayinska Pravda.
Ukrayinska Pravda. I know the Pravda bit, but the Ukrayinska is a bit more difficult for me. Who is running a news organization in Ukraine itself, which is no mean feat, as I think we'll probably discover. Okay, I'm switching mics. And the second person that we have here is a Georgian journalist, although her organization is based, I think, in the United States, although she spends her time in Georgia, and that's Natalia Antelava of Coda Story. And then the third member of our panel is a very, very distinguished American journalist who works for CNN. It's national correspondent, but I think that's a slightly misleading title given the international nature of your work. Not just a journalist over many years, a White House correspondent, many, many other things. Extraordinarily impressive CV you have, Suzanne, but also the presenter of programs on CNN as well as a working journalist, but who spent a lot of time involved in the Ukraine story recently. So that's Suzanne Malveaux, who's at the far end of the panel. So I want to talk, I want to have opportunities for questions. I want to talk about the sort of challenges and constraints that reporting the Ukraine war is throwing up, which may be in many instances the same, but also may be different from the challenges that have been thrown up by the reporting of other wars, and also may be very different for our three panelists, because operating in Ukraine is a very different challenge from operating from the United States or from the UK, as I do, and from operating in Georgia, although Georgia is very close at hand, as we know, and has suffered in its own way from Soviet intrusion. Incidentally, I'm going to call this a war, not a limited military operation, or any other kind of military operation. So no doubt I'll soon be on that blacklist, which is ever expanding, being produced by President Putin, and most of my friends and colleagues in the UK newsroom are already on. So war it is, as far as this panel is concerned. And I want to start with the experience in Ukraine and with Sevgil talking, and I want to ask you, Sevgil, about how you have managed to organize yourself in Ukraine so as to continue to do the work that you do, producing the stories you produce about the conduct of the war. So if you could, because I think this would be very instructive for lots of people who perhaps aren't as familiar with your work, like I wasn't until I started reading about it.
I'm asking myself every single day, but let me start with a quick introduction about of Ukrayinska Pravda before the war. So first independent media in Ukraine, with a big audience, around 1 million people. It was before the war. Then founded in 2000 by Georgi Gangadze, who was assassinated by policemen. And around 60 employees with different areas. So we have economic coverage, cultural, etc. So, of course, we understood that we will be the target when the war will start, and because actually our media landscape will be a target, and it will be literally a military target. And we had our security plans. So first of all, we have to think about physical security, and then for security of our website. We divided our team into parts, relocated to western part of Ukraine just 1 week before invasion, and it was more about intuition. It wasn't like we were 100% sure that it will start, but it helped us. And then cyber attacks. Of course, it was a big challenge for our team in the first week of the war. Because I can mention that, for example, in first 2 days we received thousands and thousands of cyber attacks, and one of the most powerful was around 200,000 requests per second on our website. But we succeeded it, because we did a lot of homework before. So, of course, it was dramatic period, first week of the war. But I want to tell you more about aftermath of these 6 months, just for our newsroom, how it's affected. Of course, we had a big motivation, because it's our country and it's existential war. We're all citizens, and my colleague, Oля Rudenko, yesterday mentioned that you have this choice every single day between are you citizen or are you journalist? And so, just short aftermath. 3 colleagues lost their family members, 2 joined Ukrainian army, 3 joined Territorial Defense Unit. One of our colleagues spent 10 days in occupied by Russian forces village in a shelter without electricity, without water, without food, and we actually didn't know even he was alive. Or relatives of 6 employees now live in occupied by Russia territories, and of course it's affect emotionally. 3 left Ukrayinska Pravda because they left country, because they want to take care of their kids, and some of our colleagues also volunteer. They help with humanitarian aid, they help with army. And it's all about Ukrainian society and how it's affected our newsroom. And of course, it's difficult from both sides. Physical, because you live under every single day. You're waiting that maybe missile will come, or air raid sirens. It's normal schedule in our life. So it's every single day when you're in Kiev, for example, 3 or 5 times. It depends. Actually, so after at the same time you need to think about your relatives in occupied territories, that probably if they if, for example, Russian soldiers will find out that you're a relative of this journalist, maybe it will affect them. You need to think about critics, and is it time to write publication, because every single day we also receive these questions from our audience, and we were criticized by from some of our articles and some of our investigations. I will discover this topic more. So a lot of challenges, but still we have a big motivation, because as I mentioned before, this war is the war for the right of our country to exist. And first day of this war, I told my newsroom, okay guys, we have to do our best, because if, for example, Putin will occupy Ukraine, I don't know so we will not need Ukrayinska Pravda or any state of government, any state agencies or volunteers, nothing. So it's motivated, but at the same time, of course, we are exhausted, traumatized, but very hopeful. And our last 2 days also very hopeful from news on front lines.
And are there any restrictions on what you can, I mean, provided you can get there and report it and get the information, are there any restrictions on what you can do in Ukraine, what you can report on, that are imposed by anybody on you, or leaving aside any considerations you might have yourselves?
Of course, it's a big discussion about restrictions. We have restrictions, and For foreign reporters, they also work, for example, when first time from after missile attack, for example, you can publish photos, you can share video. Last week, our Ukrainian armed forces decided to close all front lines for international reporting and domestic reporters, and it was closed for everyone, because of counteroffensive operations. So it's normal, maybe, yeah. But my personal opinion, you have to ask your officials, you have to ask United Armed Forces every single time about these restrictions, because there is a place for restrictions because they are restrictions, and where the place for manipulations because it's also possible. Because during the war, they want to hide information, they want to hide like maybe some misconducts, for example. It's also possible, and you need to figure out with this. And it's also challenging for me as a chief editor.
Okay, so we'll come back to some of the questions around that. Natalia, how does that? Tell us about your organisation, the size of it in comparison, and so on and so forth, but also the work that you're currently doing from a Georgian perspective.
Sure, but I'd like, if I may, start by saying that we really, all of us in the industry in general, possibly in the world, owe a huge debt of gratitude to all the Ukrainian journalists working in Ukraine right now. I've had a tiny taste of what it's like when in 2008 Russia invaded Georgia, and I was not living in Georgia at the time. I was in the Middle East, but I was, sent by the BBC, who was my employer at the time, to cover the war. And that balancing act of being both the citizen when your country is being bombed and you're expected to just put a completely different hat on and do your job, it is incredibly difficult. I know in America people have had a taste of it with Trump and with the 6th of January, but it's really a whole different level when it's occupation and a full-on war. And Georgia lasted a very short time. You have been living this for now 7-8 months almost, and I really can't. I really don't understand how you're doing and how you're coping. What we do at Coda, and so sort of my personal background is I actually have not been to Ukraine since this latest invasion has started and turned the world upside down. But a lot of what we do is very much informed by my own experience covering wars and conflicts for the BBC for many years. Georgia was one of them, but I spent time in Iraq, in Yemen, and I spent a lot of time in Ukraine. Throughout, starting from the annexation. I was in Crimea when Crimea was annexed, and so carried on. And when this invasion began in February, it was so striking, to anyone, I think, in the region, to hear this kind of, obviously it was the scale of the invasion was shocking, but what everyone forgot, including the newsrooms very quickly, is that war had been going on for 8 years. That war was not new. This was an old war that had gone on, and media had just kind of dropped the ball on it. And one of the reasons why I co-founded Coda was because, my experience of covering these conflicts and these crises, there was a level of frustration being part of, an amazing news operation that BBC is, but then flying in and parachuting in and then leaving and basically not seeing this story through. And then, the next time you burst into the living rooms of all these people as if like this has come out of the blue, whatever the latest crisis, the latest war is. But in reality, actually, well, no, this has been brewing all along. So the inspiration for Coda that like many startups, began with frustration of kind of like, well, what do we do about that? Like, how do we actually stay on the story? So our answer to that, after a lot of talking to people who are a lot smarter than me, was to figure out a model for a newsroom that was thematic rather than based around the latest. So we thought that we would take the overarching big themes and crises that were shaping the world, and we would look for the way they were exhibiting themselves around the world in different places. And because I'm from Georgia, and because sort of that region is part of Coda's DNA, we did do a lot of reporting in those post-war years. In those once everyone left, what we did, we were looking a lot at kind of the undercurrents of that conflict. So we did a lot of reporting on the disinformation networks that Russia set up in Crimea and other places that were very much targeting audiences in the United States and in Europe. We were doing reporting on the biolabs that suddenly came into the headlines that Pentagon funded, and that became the very much kind of the center of the Russian disinformation. So the overarching crisis that we cover at Coda are disinformation, authoritarian technology, how tech is abused, and the war on science. And within them, what we were trying to do is to look at sort of root causes of the crises, and including this invasion and the war was not how we wanted to prove our editorial model, but a lot of things that happened since have basically validated the choices of stories in terms of looking at the root causes, like how do you explain actually the whole mad sales pitch that Putin's going on with the fascists in Ukraine. Well, there is actually an explanation to it. How did Putin manage to penetrate the American, both far left and the far right? What are the narratives behind it, and so on? We made a difficult decision. We had a producer in Kiev who got out after it all started, and we did some on-the-ground reporting, but we made, a difficult decision not to send anyone to Ukraine when it started, partially because we felt, we are a small nonprofit newsroom. A lot of our resources would have had to gone into it at the time when plenty of journalists were doing fantastic job covering the actual war. What we chose to focus instead on were those kind of less obvious trends and patterns that were shaping it. I think there are stories that we've done that we wouldn't have been able to do without, newspapers like organizations like Ukrayinska Pravda. So I'll give you just one example, and it kind of ties into the previous panel about platforms and accountability. We did quite a few stories on how the role that Facebook Meta has played in the conflict, in the war, and how detrimental it's been to the small non-profit Ukrainian newsrooms who ended up fleeing not just to Russian bombs and tanks, but also losing their audiences because of the changed policies that Meta sold to the world as fighting misinformation. And you guys have done some really, really great work on that too. So that's so for the past few months we are now actually hiring reporters who will be focused on kind of interrogating this more closely and going into Ukraine and so on. But for the start of the war, we decided not to deploy and not to send, partially because there was a lot of great reporting, and also because we really are big believers that what's really important, in some ways, anyone who's done reporting from a war zone knows that, if once you get over, if you don't mind the danger, the physical danger, in some ways it is the easiest story to tell because it's a story that tells itself. It's full of drama and drive and energy and tragedy, and everything's there. But how do you sustain that once the drama is over? And that's what we're interested in. That's what we're working on. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. That's a great introduction. And how many of there are you doing this valuable work?
We are now 20, but majority journalists, but not all. But the team is 20, and we're very much spread around. A few of us are in Georgia, but we no longer. So we have a person now in Warsaw soon, and starting, and in Washington, in London. So spread all over the place. In India, actually, yeah. very
that's great.
completely remote global.
The reason I ask you that is because I'm going to come to Suzanne next, and Suzanne and I both work for organisations which number the thousands, not the 20s or the 60s, and so which makes it even more unbelievable what you guys are doing. But Suzanne, tell us about the CNN approach to the war in Ukraine. How many people are actually deployed there? What's going on? What you're reporting about, and in the same way as we've just heard.
Sure. I mean, sometimes it's a blessing and a curse, right? To be a part of a huge organization, but certainly in war coverage, it is a blessing. I mean, you have multiple layers of support, and the teams you're serving, the domestic audience, you're serving the international audience. You have bureaus around the world that are involved in gathering the information. They are deploying various resources. You have producers, editors, photographers, war correspondents, and then you have those like myself who are rotating in these shifts. And you start from the very beginning. Some of the shifts are short, some are longer, depending on how you're deployed. But the resources are just incredible. And so my hat's off to both of you, and we work very closely with many of the Ukrainians who just are a marvel in terms of what you do and what you've brought to tell the story. We were there from the very beginning. We set up a bureau in Kyiv. We also set up a bureau in Lviv. I was deployed to Lviv at the time. And we went in it was about 3 months into the conflict. We went in through the Polish border. We were at the border for about 3 hours at one checkpoint. They said go to another checkpoint. We ended up in the beginning of the line, the front of the line, in about an hour or so. There were many Ukrainians at that time who, thousands of them, the lines that were miles long with the cars that were trying to get back into the country, back to their homes to try to find their husbands or their grandparents or anything that was left. We were able to talk with a woman who was in the front of the line with her 8-year-old boy in the car, and I had asked her how long she had been there, and she said 4 days in the car. But she was at the front of the line, and she was so happy just to get back into the country. And so there was a mass movement that was influx that was coming in. At the same time, being based in Lviv, there was also thousands of people who we met. I mean, it was not hard to meet and talk to Ukrainians, but thousands of people who were coming from the east who are obviously trying to escape the warfare, and who had lost and left behind the elderly and the wounded, and who were completely traumatized. One of the challenges that we faced, and something that was very different than previously, was the real-time experiences of war that people were sharing through social media. And at the time I was there, we were covering Mariupol and the steel plant and the people who were trapped inside of the steel plant. And I met a woman whose husband was there inside of the plant, and they had been pummeled and pummeled for weeks and weeks. And I had an opportunity to meet and to talk with her about her experience of her husband who was there, and he was able to borrow a cell phone, and he was texting and emailing on a daily basis, chronicling his experience and what he had described as hell, because of the pictures that he was taking and showing his wife of people with no legs, no medicine, and had been bombed, and finally told his wife that they would be losing communication because he was going to be surrendering to the Russian forces, and indeed we told her story on television and in print, and she did lose contact with her husband, and at that point it was almost like a daily check-in with her, really, to see how she was coping, and as her husband was deteriorating, he had turned yellow, jaundice, and lost some weight, but that was their way of communicating and keeping in touch with the outside world. There were other people inside of the plant as well who took gorgeous pictures, photographs, and posted them on Instagram or Facebook. And so it was miraculous in a way that there was this ability, when you think of old-time war, when people wrote letters to their loved ones and got them weeks later, that in real time you had people who were experiencing, you know, horrific things and were able to share it with the world and demonstrate the need that was there at that time.
That's pretty extraordinary, isn't it? And is that a real difference in the coverage of this war from coverage of previous wars? I mean, every war tends to be different in the way in which the media can cover it. You know, you have different developments, embeds, and so on and so forth. Is this war different in any way as far as CNN is concerned, in terms of the use of social media, the accessibility of material which you have to verify, obviously, but which comes from as it were the front line, but which is not your own reporter's work? Is it different in that respect, or is it different in any other respect from the wars that we've covered in the past?
I think there's a real due diligence that the organization is taking, because there are so many ethical questions around using that material. And of course, if you're using it in real time, or if it's live streaming, there's a process in which you must vet, and you must be sure that this is not staged, that this is real, that this is not for the cameras. There were generals and high-level soldiers inside of the plant who would make very dramatic statements about the war is not over, we must not surrender, you know, this is the place of my life and my death. And so there are ethical questions about, are you broadcasting and hearing, you know, a suicide mission, or is this something that you should even be sharing through your network? But there's a very rigorous process, at least, that CNN uses, so that even the stories of the filtration camps, where, as you know, the people who are left behind in Donbass in the east, who are tortured and remain there. CNN was not necessarily going to say conclusively that that was taking place until Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International were able to confirm and able to jump in and talk about the numbers and the visuals, the things they're seeing. But there's a whole team of people that are looking at drone video, checking in with military sources, troops on the ground, various ways of trying to confirm the information. But if CNN cannot confirm, you just state, you know, from the beginning, we cannot independently confirm.
I'll bring that question back to you, Sevgil, in a moment. I just wanted to ask one other thing, which is, are you constrained at CNN in the sorts of things that you can show by audience sensibilities? I mean, the war correspondents at the BBC are forever telling people like me, who have to make judgments about what pictures we can show and what we can't show in relation to audience sensibilities, that we're sanitizing war because they see such horror and they're unable to show that horror in full on news bulletins. Have you faced that problem in this war? Again, is that something that's been an issue at CNN?
So I wouldn't call it a problem, since I don't make those decisions, but it is a collective decision, and there's an editorial team that will look at the video, and we have, for the most part, I think, abided by some of the guidelines for prisoners of war, so that the faces are blurred, that the identities are not revealed, that there's dignity in what we are showing during wartime. Okay, good.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. So coming back to you, Sevgil, this social media issue, this profusion of material online, there's drone pictures, all sorts of other pictures. I mean, you must have that, even more of it coming into you from all the people in Ukraine who are your sources. How do you, as it were, sort out what might be disinformation or misinformation from what is credible and real, and use that in your work? Because you don't have the resources of
a lot of
BBC or
people
CNN, of course.
in Ukraine, I mean, among colleagues, call this war the first TikTok war, and it is true, because a lot of soldiers, I mean, Ukrainian soldiers spotted the video from front lines in TikTok, and it was like that. What I want to say, for example, in the beginning of war, we received around 7 million views per day, 7 million unique visitors per day, and now it's around 2. And it's not only about people are tired because of war, because a lot of people want to consume news from Telegram channels, anonymous Telegram channels, and it's #1 platform for news now in Ukraine. And because you receive news like in your every moment, and you follow every moment. You don't need to go to your website, etc. So people are very happy, and a lot of photos from a lot of social video from TikTok they also posted, and you don't have a chance to compete with that. And that's why it's not our way. And I explained it very shortly to our journalist when we understood that probably like Telegram will be the main channel during this war. But of course we use a lot of tools just to find this video and to find photos. And what I want to mention that I discovered like 3 important rules, and they helped us to gather information from different cities still. For the first days of the war, when it was like panic and it was dangerous, I just posted every single day a simple question, how are you? And people left a lot of messages, and they started to send me a lot of photos of bodies. And but we have a lot of people now in different cities, even occupied by Russia. For example, I still receive a lot of photos, a lot of news from Kherson, which is occupied now, because people trust me, and I know that they definitely it's about more like civil journalism. Of course, you need to check everything, but it's a dilemma. But we use tools that help us just to follow our rules and principles, but at the same time think about just informing our audience very fast and with trust information.
Okay, that's very interesting. And do you find that there have been occasions when you've been and somebody's tried to fool you into using information that wasn't accurate? Or are your sources just very different sources and you know who they are?
I think what helped us that we have a lot of sources for years and years from our work in Ukraine. Even for example, this story about a famous motto of this war about Russian warship, for example, which suddenly appeared in the first days of the war. A lot of Ukrainian media spread information that the author of this quote was released, and it's Roman Gribov, and everyone quoted him. Everyone invited him in a lot of TV channels. He became a real hero, but one of our colleagues said, I don't trust it. It's not true because he didn't have an access to this place just to say that, and she checked this information with her sources in different agencies, and we were only one media, not only one, but few media didn't post like photos and that he is a real author. And then the head of this agency, after 2 months, when he was actually released from Russian capture, he explained that it was dangerous just to tell that it's not a real, that real author of this phrase is this quote in capture, like he captured by Russian. So it was like that. So, and a lot of examples in daily basis when people can use this information, when you delivered information from anonymous sources as well. So, but simple truth, you need to have more sources as you can and check information, verify information as much as possible.
Okay, so we were talking about an existential war, which this is for everybody in Ukraine. Does the fact that it's an existential war change the rules of journalism from what it would be if you were covering a war somewhere else in the world? So the situation that I'm in the UK, that Suzanne is in the US, we're covering a war. We have, and I always say that the BBC's impartiality is not value-free because it has the values of democracy embedded within it. So we wouldn't ever be on the side of an autocrat and a despot in any given war. But in other ways, we're impartial as between Ukraine and Russia. But if you're in an existential war, that's presumably is a luxury you can't really afford, isn't it? So does that alter the
this, of course, it's war, existential war for Ukraine, but at the same time we fight for democracy, we fight for principles, and I want to mention my mentor here, who's a brilliant journalist actually, and former editor of The Guardian, Alan Rusbridger, and a few years ago he told me the story about Edward Snowden, and that also they were very criticized by even British government, and he went to this parliament and he received a question from one of members parliament that, do you love this country? And he responded that of course I love country, and England is democracy, and just to protect a democracy where like freedom of speech is the main part. And of course you have to think about like harm, not to harm. You have, I explained before that you have a choice and you have these discussions inside you every single day, citizen, journalists. But even 2 months ago we published a popular story in our media about our former ombudsman that actually she accused human rights because she misconduct with sexual violences. She reported about like fake stories, and we published this story, and we received a lot of critical comments, and people started to ask us, is it a good story that you publish? It's not help us win this war. She used these tools just to help our country. Why you do that? You're a traitor, you work for. But it was very important just to show that we are not the same with Russian media, where you as a journalist, as me as a journalist, as Ukrainian journalist, I need to think about my principles, rules, follow them, thinking about that I'm a citizen, yes, but at the same time it's like a Bible, like truth is our mess, and at the same time your enemy uses only propaganda tools. They lie about everything. Yesterday, like we shared this example about Bucha, about people, about that we're still receiving the blame that US did it, so it was staged, everything. But literally, I know that because in Bucha, I mentioned before that one of my colleague father was shot by Russian army. And in pain, I lost my good friend who was a classmate at Harvard, Brent Renault, and he came to Ukraine just to film this story about refugee crisis, and he was also brutally killed by them. And you know that. So, and
so one of the reasons I asked you that question was because I know that before the war happened, that you, as an organisation, were very prominent in investigating corruption in Ukraine. In fact, you lost 2 of your journalists who were killed investigating corruption in Ukraine. So you were a very brave operation internally, telling stories that were about the problems with Ukraine before the war happened. So your answer is even more interesting in that context. Natalia, do you have a perspective on this?
I do, and
yeah.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Yes. So I very much see kind of my role, Coda's role, as and would very much like everyone, all other non-Ukraine-based journalists too. If more journalists outside of Ukraine see it the same way, I think we'll be better off. I think what's really important for us, we very much see the importance, our role in actually explaining why Ukraine is the existential war for the West as well, and how things that are happening in Ukraine now are going to have an effect on Western societies in months and years to come. And it's not, Ukraine is not unique in that. When we were first setting up Coda, we often use the example of Libya and the killing of there was a NATO bombing of Libya, and then there was literally, and it was on everybody's screen all the time, and we were sort of bombarded with coverage. And then Gaddafi was dead, and then there was nothing for about 6 months. And after that, the Benghazi killing of the US ambassador happened, and Libya was back in the news for about 2 weeks. And these gaps, right, and then nothing again. But what happened, what happened in Tripoli and then what happened in Benghazi did end up having a massive effect on the US election during, when Trump beat Hillary Clinton. But media is very bad at making these connections. We journalists, the news industry is very bad at making this connections and sort of trying to explain how something that happens in faraway, remote places affects us and the societies we live in very profound ways. And I think it's especially important today when we all use the same tech. We're all on on Facebook, and we're all using Google, and we're all live in more globalized world than ever before, and experiments that are happening in faraway places like Myanmar or Ukraine, come back and then play out in Western societies. And we're all in this battle between authoritarianism and democracy. And Ukraine is a very interesting war because it's the first war that we've had that is a lot more black and white than any other conflict. It's a lot more understandable. It's a lot more photogenic because there are more people who speak English. The TikTok videos are effective. Ukraine managed to sort of grab imagination. I mean, sadly, there's a little bit of racism in there as well. Europe seems to be a lot more open to, white refugees than brown refugees and so on. So there is all this combination of factors where Ukraine, is easier to relate to and easier to understand. And I think we should be actually jumping on that as an opportunity of using this war to explain how whatever happens there, besides the horrible human tragedy, poses the risk to the rest of the world and democratic societies everywhere.
That's a very interesting point. Suzanne, does that influence the framework within which you see CNN reports and indeed the BBC as well?
Yes, I do want to pick up on that point of connectivity, because I think in a philosophical and theoretical way, you talk and everyone understands the connection with fighting for democracy, that if that's a highbrow argument, but it's just the basic, fundamental fight. At the same time, there were things that happened, I thought, that really illustrated that just the common humanity that we all experience, which is based and rooted sometimes in our traumatic experiences and how we heal. When my brief stay assignment in Ukraine was sandwiched really bookmarked between two tragedies in the United States. The first one being the Buffalo massacre targeting African Americans, and at the end of the assignment was the Uvalde school massacre, the shooting. And in between these two events, there was a question as to whether or not people would really still pay attention to and care about what was going on in Ukraine. And we had an assignment. I found someone who really bridged the gap there, an American who was in Ukraine, who went to Bucha, who went to Irpin, to try to help and train people in the first process of healing, whether it was getting children to open up and draw their feelings, or to talk, or to deal with the trauma. And this was a story that, you know, we really did not think would make air, and actually got a lot of traction during that time, because I think there was that common humanity where people could understand trauma and healing throughout the world, that there was some place where people could meet in that way.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. Do you think, though, that the support which the West is giving to Ukraine, because it seems to be a war between good and evil, democracy and autocracy, is such that it's even in the West, way away from where the war's taking place, there is a reluctance to be critical of anything that's going on in Ukraine and anything that went on in Ukraine. I mean, President Zelensky is a national hero in the UK, and yet, you know, Sevgil's organization and many other organizations in Ukraine did some very penetrating analysis of Zelensky before the war, which wasn't entirely congratulatory. And now we're in a position where he can do no wrong. So, and that's true of coverage in the United States, I think, generally speaking, coverage in the UK, probably coverage in most of Europe, and amongst all of those countries that are supporting Ukraine. Of course, we have to remember that there are countries, some of which are represented here, which have much more sympathy for the Russian position for various reasons. So, does that frame that sort of good versus evil, democracy versus autocracy, does that frame our coverage? And does it mean that, for example, we don't try very hard to understand, not to agree with, but to understand the Russian position, which you seem to be doing, Natalia, in your work? Do you think that's happening in the West, Suzanne?
Well, I think that the selling of the message has been very effective, and I think President Zelensky was out there from the very beginning, was not hiding from the media, was out in the streets, was very accessible, and I think that enabled certainly Western media to have access to, you know, his messages and his messaging. I also think there's a question as to whether or not that changes, right? Because you have the messaging being that it is tied to the fight for democracy, which many people can relate to in the United States, because they're seeing the institutions being threatened, the democratic institutions being threatened, being questioned, whether or not they're being trusted, the January 6th attack on the US Capitol, that there are ways to connect these two stories and these experiences. The question will be whether or not they can maintain that interest if the domestic audience, say midterm elections, looks to the economy, looks to gas prices, things that they feel would impact them more directly, whether or not you will still be able to have that kind of almost seamless parallel type of storyline.
Okay, Natalia.
Yeah.
And then I want to come to a few questions before we end.
I think there is a really, Ukraine is a country at war, and it is running a very successful and very impressive propaganda operation. I think there are plenty of journalists in Ukraine, including ones in this room, who have done critical reporting on Ukraine and the Ukrainian military and looked at some questions, and we're seeing more of it now that, the situation is changing. But I think it is important for the Western media not to do what Western media has done in the past, which is, Zelensky is going to do what he has to do, which is to, keep pushing his cause. But it's important for the Western media not to be putting people on pedestals ever, no matter who they are. And I think, many Western media organizations, including the BBC, did that with Aung San Suu Kyi. And that backfired. So let's not create more Aung San Suu Kyis. Let's not, no one's perfect, and we all need to remember that. But everyone needs to be doing their job. We know what the job is, right?
Okay, I'm going to come back to all three of you before we end, but I wonder if there are any questions that anybody would like to ask at this stage of the conversation. There's someone at the back, someone over there, two people over there. Have we got a microphone? Yeah, we have. Thank you. There's a chap on the right, and then a woman on the left.
My name is Swapnil Mehta. I'm a PhD candidate doing a data science PhD researching online disinformation. Really great sort of conversation. I have a question for all of you, but in particular about, it was rightly pointed out that this is like an online war. It's fought on TikTok. Social media features a lot into the kinds of stories you break. I wonder if you track the impact of your stories post breaking them, in particular to understand the kinds of risks that emerge from a social media context, and if that influences how you break stories in the future. Yeah.
Do you have a look at what happens on social media as a consequence of the work that you do and any implications that may have? Do you do that, Sevgil? Do you do that, Natalia, with your work? Do you have a look at the social media impact that it makes, or whether it has any resonance on social media? Yeah, go on, Natalia. Go on.
I mean, yes, I'm not sure I completely understand the question. I mean, obviously everyone is looking at what impact their stories are having, so we do too, right? On social media, I think we are very wary of getting into, there are newsrooms that are very small newsrooms that are very active in conversations on social media. We are not one of them at all, intentionally so, because especially with this topic, it's very easy to get dragged down the all sorts of propagandas, trolls, and so on. So I mean, yes, we'll look at the impact and what are the conversations triggered by the stories we do, but that's not the deciding factor in our editorial decisions.
Great. I think we had a question from Courtney, did we, or someone, or you've deferred? Okay. There's a person just behind you. Yeah, Ken.
Hi, my name is Ken Choi. I'm an editor from Chosun Daily newspaper, Korea. I covered the war, Bosnian War in 1995, dragged off a bus at a gunpoint on my forehead. I had to, struggle to get on a plane to get out of Sarajevo on a UN military flight. So it was, and then I smuggled a North Korean POW out of North Korea. So I went through a whole host of all these physically dangerous stuff, and I haven't been able to tell the story until a couple of years ago to my wife, who was sitting next to me, because she would freak out. But as I got older, I moved up the ladder. I became an editor. I managed journalists, and I became extremely risk averse, meaning, sending journalists to dangerous lines. I'm trying to sort of dissuade them, or tell them, okay, we can rely on third-party stories. You don't have to be there on the spot, because unless your security is 100% guaranteed, I would really, dissuade them to go. So I want to ask you three: how do you manage the security issues of these journalists being on a front line? And I know you guys are, doing an excellent job, and we are relying on you. But as you probably will face this dilemma as you grow up in your career, and I'm just wondering how you manage this thing.
Suzanne, you
yeah,
with that?
I will show you. I've been hitting my phone. These are two apps that they put me on immediately when I got to Ukraine, and one of them is a universal map, and it essentially gives you all of the alerts. An hour ago, red alert, aerial threat, siren sounding, take cover now. Zaporizhzhia an hour ago, President Zelensky, over 30 settlements were liberated in Kharkiv region, and it goes on and on. And so this is an app that has the bombings, the red alerts, the announcements, the military movements, and this was the first thing that they put on my phone. The second thing was an alert app, which basically was what you were referring to, the alarms, the sirens that go off if there is anything that's in the sky, whether it's a flock of birds or it's a missile or an anti-missile defense that would take down one of those. And so those are the kind of the tools, I guess, that are, I've never used them before until this particular conflict. This was new for me. But I think it probably represents a different level of sophistication in terms of your awareness. We were lucky we have security with us. Lviv is a very strange place, as you know, because it's quiet and people are out having coffee and drinking and, you know, flying kites, and then the sirens go off and everyone takes cover and goes in the basements. The journalists work, we work, and then the sirens, the all clear goes off maybe 2-3 hours later. And then there's a rhythm to life that you amazingly very quickly get used to, adjusted to your body and your mind physically, just listening to hearing those sirens and what needs to be done, and then the rhythm of life continues.
That to me sounds like a real difference from previous wars. I'm not sure they had apps that told them when there was incoming in, in previous wars that I've been aware of at any rate. Sevgil, do you
of course, we provide all equipment, we have security, we have, but you need to understand that in Ukraine, everyone in danger. And for example, Vera Girich, who is our colleague, she was killed by missile in her own apartment in Kiev. And you don't know, it's something you can be protected. But I want to mention that yes, it's random. But people are very motivated. And when, for example, I mentioned before that we relocated part of our team, and one part of our team stayed in Kiev, and they told me, no idea. I will definitely stay here. I want to cover that, and because of very huge motivation. And our reporters want to cover this war. Our reporters want to go to the front lines. For example, we have maybe youngest reporter of this war, 23 years old girl, and it was her decision. I was trying to stop her, and it's her first experience. And she was evacuated. Then she came back to Kiev, and now she covers every city near front line because she wants that. And I just can't avoid, and I can say, no, please don't do that.
Natalia, did you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's interesting. It's like 3 really interesting perspectives, because Suzanne has a massive organization behind her that provides all the security, and you do feel a lot safer. You know, I've covered conflicts with BBC, and it's just completely different ballgame. Yeah. You have no choice. You know, you are living this war. Like, you have to. So we have a choice, and we have made a decision not to deploy, because I can't provide the level of security to my journalists that I was used to at the BBC. We actually had an incident where a former colleague, a former employee, called me early in, on, and wanted to go and asked to be deployed, and we thought about it and we said no, and she was killed. She was a Russian journalist who was killed in a missile attack, Oksana Baulina. So, if you're not able to provide the level of security that the CNN can, and with, a lot of people doing fantastic job on the ground, I just feel it's not necessary to put people in danger unless you can. So it's, difficult choices for us, but we feel that there are many ways of cover wars beyond the actual, bombs and shooting, and we're trying to do our bit there.
Thank you. I'm afraid we've run out of time, which is a real shame, because I can see that there are lots of other people who would like to ask questions, but we've had an entire hour. I just want to say thank you to our panel, Suzanne Malveaux from CNN, Natalia Antelava from Coda Story, and really most particularly to Sevgil Musaieva, who I think has been inspirational listening to her account of her and her team's work in Ukraine. I think we'd all want to give her a huge round of applause.